Hi, I'm Miles Yutt, and I did my project on piano tuning and musical temperaments. So I've always been involved with music ever since, wee little toddler. I couldn't even probably sit over this table when I started playing the piano. And it's always been, a lot of fun playing the piano. In 8th grade, I started to learn how to play the trombone, which was a great instrument to learn how to play. But it was very interesting because the mechanism between, how you make noise on a trombone and how you make noise on a piano is so different. And one thing that especially interested me is, how do you tune a trombone versus how you tune a piano? With a trombone, you have the whole range of the slide with which you can tune. You're not set at like certain notes. Whereas on the piano, you tune those notes right to, where they are, and you can't really adjust them once they're set there, unless you have, your tuner come in and work for 3 hours to tune the whole thing again. So. What interested me is how do you determine, what those notes are that you set up on the piano? And this also plays into, listening to music on the radio today, that we don't really think about, is this music on the radio really in tune or not in tune? Because you just sort of listen to it. But I want you guys to all, after I present today, I want you to think more about, what does it mean for something to be in tune? And maybe you'll be more aware of intonation, on radio. So my project was on piano tuning. I used tools like these ones up here to try to tune a piano, and I learned very quickly that it is really hard to tune a piano. Like, there are like 200 strings on it. You have to tune each one of them. It has to be exactly right, and just takes hours to do one piano. Especially for me, who I've never tuned or tried to tune a piano before. It's very hard on your fingers. You have to play notes over and over and over again. Like these notes up here, you just have to keep playing them over and over again. It's really loud and just, something that I'm not ready to do yet. So I focused more on tuning individual notes in the piano. 1 or 2 notes that maybe had fallen out of tune with the rest of the piano, but then by ear or with the tuner, you can put them right back in. It sounds, almost back up to normal. So, and I think that it was very successful because just even the quality of the sound of the piano, when you fix, just a couple notes, really changes the overall sound of the piano. Improves it greatly. So, and I hope to show that to you guys here. So, from the research side of my project, I worked on temperaments, and temperaments are really, really fascinating. It has to do with, we know that there are, 12 notes in our chromatic scale that we use, but how do you determine, how far apart they are from one another? How do you figure out, if you start with one note, how do you find the rest of them in the scale? So, first thing I'm going to just talk a little bit briefly about, sound. How does sound work? And the way that the sound works is that you hear vibrations in the air molecules, vibrating back and forth. And they're only moving such a small distance, but these pressure waves can travel, across the room. That's how you can hear me speak. And the faster that they vibrate, the higher pitch the sound that you hear is, and the slower that they vibrate, the lower pitch. And if they vibrate a greater distance, over a greater distance, it's louder. And then if they don't vibrate as much, it's softer. So if you're at like a rock concert, you can sort of feel, the heavy bass like vibrating you. That's because it's moving. The air is vibrating a great distance because it's so loud. So interference is really cool. When you play 2 sound waves at the same time, you hear both the sound waves, but you also hear a composite wave that has characteristics of both the sound of the original waves here. And there are 2 kinds of interferences: constructive and destructive interference. And well, what happens is if you see, every so often these sync up at points where these are labeled by CI, that the high pressure point on this wave here is lined up with the high pressure point there. And you get, when you add them together, you get a very high pressure point on this green wave. The green is the sum of these 2 waves. At the same time, because these are slightly different frequency waves, you get points where on this top one, you have a high pressure point with a low pressure point on the bottom one. And when you add them together, you get 0 pressure there. And so, depending on how different the frequencies of these waves are, you get different patterns for this green wave here, this composite wave here. And an interesting property is that the further apart that the frequencies are, the closer together these constructive and destructive interferences are, and you get a faster vibrating green wave like this, or even further apart, more like this here. So this green wave you can hear in a bunch of different ways. Sometimes it sounds like a pitch, but when it's very slow, you get what's called a beat tone, a beating tone. And beating tones are pretty much, you know, how piano tuners, it's the real key to tuning a piano, because with beating tones, you can figure out how far apart notes are compared to each other. If, you know, two notes beat 1 beat per second, if you can hear the note beating at 1 beat per second, that's exactly, you can tell that they're different by 1 hertz. So when you're, say if you're tuning, a lot of notes on the piano have 2 or 3 strings that are all tuned to the same pitch. So if you have 2 strings that are in tune for 1 note, and then the last one is just out of tune, you hear a sort of warbling, where it sounds like it's sort of fading in and out really quickly. And the closer that you get into tune, the slower the warbling gets, and then when you finally get it perfectly into tune, there's no warbling at all. So I'm going to try and demonstrate that here with this window here. Let's see. That one. This one. Now, let's go on. All right, so this will play just a regular pitch here. Now, what I'm doing here, this is showing you, you know, a sine wave. This is just a sine wave that's playing, and that represents, you know, high pressure and low pressure. High pressure's on the top, low pressure's on the bottom. But this is, you know, the electrical signal here, and I'm just going to turn up the volume a tiny bit. And then this bar right here will cause a wave in here to show up, and this bar in here will make this wave, the amplitude of this wave, how high and low it goes, increase and decrease over time. And it'll create the same beating effect. So you can see when this is at a high point, these waves are all on top, these waves are all have a high amplitude. When it reaches the middle, they're all very flat, and then when it's on the bottom, they invert and come back. And so it cycles around like that. And as I increase this, the beating gets faster. As this wave moves up and down faster, the beating gets faster. And you can sort of hear this. This is like if it's louder when these peaks are all up here and it's softer here. And so as it fades back and forth through the peaks and the flat, you get a warbling effect. And as this gets faster, you start to hear, you know, more and more out of tune beating. And then at some point, it starts to sound like 2 different tones. Right about there, you can start to hear, it doesn't sound quite like 1 pitch anymore, but there are actually 2 pitches that start to spread apart from each other. And you can see on the bottom, let me see if I can move it up actually. As these continue to spread out, you get a cool wave form on the bottom, where you have, this is the same thing as I was showing you before, that you have this wave, it looks like it's making a wave with the peaks and the troughs here, and also this way. But then there's also another wave on the inside, and this is called the carrier. And then you're modulating with this one. So you can see how this one is low here, so this is inverted. This is a very high peak there. But it's negative here, so it's positive. Right here it's 0, so it corresponds to 0 right there. And then here it's a very high positive. That's a very high positive. And so consequently you get 2 different tones sounding. And then at a certain point, right here, you get a very harmonious sound. And this happens because the frequency of this wave is exactly 1/5 the frequency of this wave. But the interesting thing is, if I were to play these waves separately and not at the same time, you get a totally different sound. So without the carrier, this is what this one sounds like by itself. You right? Isn't that sort of weird? And as I'm changing it, this is the sound that it's making. But as soon as I add in this wave, I get a totally different sound. So so the effects when you play 2 waves together are totally different from when you're listening to them apart. And that's really important, because when you're playing piano and you're doing tuning, you're always playing notes against each other to hear, you know, where are the beat frequencies compared to each other. And then another thing is, if I'm really close here, you can see that, like on the bottom screen, it looks like it's, you know, moving up and down and moving quickly, and that shows that it is out of tune a little bit. And as I bring it right up to where here 550 is exactly 5 times 110, it's right in tune. So I'll stop this. And so the idea is if you want to have an interval that's perfectly in tune, you eliminate the beating tones, which on a piano is really hard to do, as I'll explain in a moment. Because if you get rid of some, you're going to make others, and it all adds up. And so you have to try to like smooth. It's like trying to fit a carpet that's too big for a room, into the room. When you push down on one end, it pops up on the other end. So you have to find a way to balance it out evenly. And so using those hammers, you twist the pegs on a piano and adjust the tensions on the strings, and you can manipulate the pitches to vibrate at exactly the right frequency that you want. And that's the whole idea behind tuning a piano. Now it all depends on how do you arrange these pitches, how do you put them in the right order. And there are a lot of different ways that people have attempted to arrange these pitches using the chromatic scale. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is called just intonation. And just intonation is probably the most basic way of tuning, because it's all based on listening to those tones and making sure that there are no beats. So here I have my synthesizer set up in a just intonation temperament on C, and so this is a middle C, and if I play any interval, it doesn't beat at all. And if I were to just play a scale, you probably couldn't tell the difference between that and the regular keyboard, which would sound like this, in fact. It sounds identical. Is that loud enough for you guys, or are you going to turn it up? Alright, let's turn it up so better. Okay, great. So now, where it really comes out is when you start to play intervals together. So if I play chords, this chord sounds really good. Now watch as I play up the chromatic scale chords. You get all these really awful sounding, out of tune chords, which is why no person in the right mind would ever tune a piano this way, because you can never play in any other key except for this one here. And this was the first approach used to tuning. Actually, Pythagoras, the Greek mathematician, invented his tuning based on the Pythagorean tuning, which was all based on fifths. So all the fifths are tuned to one another, and all the fifths in this scale sound very even right here. But what happens is, as I said, there's going to be a spot where it doesn't line up, and 11 of these, there are 12 fifths, like the cycle of fifths, the circle of fifths. There are 12 fifths, play with 2 hands, right? And then going the other way. But there's 1/5 that I didn't play, and this is called a wolf tone, as you'll hear, because they likened it to the sound of a howling wolf, because it's just a little too narrow to sound just like a fifth. So I can't even listen to that for too long. Just chords of it just sound really, horrendous, and you could never tune a piano like that. Let's go back to this. You can never tune a piano that way, because with that, the notes so out of tune, it wouldn't work. Now, in Pythagoras' time, the scale that they used only had 7 notes. So it actually worked fine for them. They didn't have to worry about this issue because they didn't have to go around the whole cycle of fifths. They only used the first 7. But as people started to experiment playing in different keys and their music modulated between keys, they needed ways to use more of these keys, especially the one with this wolf interval in it, without without affecting the other keys too adversely. And so in the classical and Baroque era, in the Baroque and classical era, there's the advent of something called well-tempered tuning.